You think that seat is for you? His voice cracked through the courtroom like a slap. He grabbed the black woman's arm, yanking her as if she were refuse, his eyes blazing as if he embodied the law itself. But within seconds, his own hands would crush the very career he had painstakingly built. Because she didn't utter a word. She simply raised one thing that made the entire room freeze, a senior FBI badge. So what about you? Is your state governed by law or by the color of your skin? Do you still believe justice exists in America, or has it long been strangled by men like him? She sat in the last row, where the weakest light in the courtroom couldn't fully reach her. Her red blazer fit snugly, without a single wrinkle or wasted movement. Her wrist rested lightly on her knee, her back straight. She didn't look around, didn't smile, didn't show the slightest unease like many others on their first time in court. Her eyes were locked on the defendant's stand, as if measuring precisely the millimeters between declared authority and actual justice. Those sitting nearby occasionally glanced at her, perhaps because of the striking red blazer, or maybe because they weren't used to seeing someone sit with such presence, as if the observer were the one deciding the outcome. The right door swung open. A heavy click of a shoe struck the floor. Officer Bryson Hale entered like he was stepping onto a battlefield. His eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of disobedience. His back was straight, shoulders squared, his gaze laced with the arrogance of habit. He didn't care who was the defendant, who were the relatives, or who were just observers. He only needed to spot whoever didn't know their place. A soldier of the law who wasn't looking for justice, but for anyone out of line. And he always found someone. When his eyes stopped at the last row, his pupils tightened. He approached, his boots clacking on the wooden floor, each step a declaration of self-appointed authority. No one spoke, but the silence in the room changed texture. The woman remained still, showing no sign of intimidation. Her eyes didn't shift. She didn't look away, nor did she appear confrontational. She was simply watching, as if recording every move, every gesture, every breath in the room to bring somewhere else, where nothing would be metaphorical anymore. Hale stopped next to her seat, leaned in low, his voice hissing through his teeth. I didn't see you stand when I walked in. It wasn't a question but a signal that discipline was about to be enforced. He was used to people reacting, used to automatic remorse, to flustered eyes and stumbling apologies. But this time he got nothing. The woman tilted her head slightly, barely noticeable, and replied in an even tone, I saw no reason to stand. No raised voice, no provocation, no unnecessary explanation. But the simplicity of her words cut straight into his pride like a blade. Hale's lips twisted into a crooked smile, the kind of smile worn by someone whose ego had just been scraped in public but couldn't yet accept it. He straightened up, turned toward the others as if to announce, she's the problem, then faced her again. Without calling for backup or giving a signal, he reached out, grabbed her wrist and yanked hard. The woman stood up, not resisting yet not yielding. Hale glanced around as if he wanted everyone to remember this moment, as if he had just restored a challenged order. But right then when she turned to look him straight in the eye, the entire room seemed to freeze. That look didn't resist, it questioned. There was no warning, but the light in her eyes alone was enough to make ordinary people back off. But not Hale. He gripped her wrist tighter, his voice clipped, each word dropping like a weight. Where's your ID? It wasn't meant to be answered, it was to intimidate, to show that even the calm ones would tremble if he wanted them to. But she didn't react the way he expected, and that, more than any words, lit the match for everything that was about to unfold. This isn't your lunch break. Stand when you're allowed to. His voice rang through the courtroom like a pre-recorded order, familiar and laced with insult. He didn't shout, but the sharp edge at the end of his sentence made those nearby flinch. It was a kind of power that needed no approval because it had been used too often to need permission. He spoke as if it were sacred protocol, and anyone who didn't comply deserved to be humiliated. She remained seated, unmoved. It wasn't defiance, and it wasn't because she hadn't heard him. It was simply that his words didn't carry enough weight for her to respond. Instead of speaking, she tilted her head slightly, a movement so small that one might think she had a stiff neck. But in that motion, a sliver of light slid across the bridge of her nose and shattered into a sharp gleam in her pupil. It didn't glare, didn't pierce, but it made everyone watching instinctively hold their breath. In a room where everything followed the repetitive rhythm of accusation, argument, and verdict, her calm, cold stillness stood out like it didn't belong. Hale leaned forward. He mistook the silence for arrogance, a kind of quiet contempt. He was used to compliance, to eyes dropping to the floor the moment he walked into a room. But not this one. This gaze held no contempt and certainly no submission. It seemed to read him, his every movement, every tick, every flash of anger poorly hidden beneath a veil of pride. He had no idea what label to assign to the woman sitting across from him. She sat like an undefined space, something he couldn't quite categorize, and for that very reason he felt threatened. He lowered his voice, but the tone grew colder. "I'll say this again. This is a courtroom, not a gallery for idle observers. Stand up." He pronounced each word like a deliberate jab. This was no longer about protocol, it was a warning strike. The room began to shift. A few people subtly turned away. Some ducked into their papers as if they had suddenly become urgent. Everyone could sense the imbalance creeping into the air. Something was off, something was about to break from the expected order, but no one quite knew how or why to step in. The woman raised her eyes again, this time not toward the bench but directly at the man standing before her. Her expression held no disdain, no anger, and no visible concern. It was simply calm, so calm it unsettled those watching. She spoke for the first time since entering the room. "I heard you," she said, her tone steady as a breath, "and I know exactly where I'm sitting." No one interrupted. Her words left no room for dispute. They did not deny the authority of the court, but neither did they grant anyone the power to define someone else's place in it. Hale clenched his jaw. He was not used to being talked back to, especially not in a place he considered his domain. To him, any act of defiance required punishment or at the very least, ridicule. But this time he wasn't even sure who he was dealing with. She didn't retreat, didn't attack, didn't offer excuses. Her composure made him feel as though he were the one on trial, without having realized when it began. And that was what truly unnerved him, because in this room he had never imagined there would come a day when he lost control, when he was no longer the center of attention, outshone not by argument, not by status, but by someone who simply stayed where she chose to be. Hale didn't wait for another word. He walked straight over and grabbed the woman's arm with such force that a few people in the middle rows flinched and turned around. The pressure in his grip wasn't just a reflex of his profession. It was anger built up from her earlier gaze, from her upright posture, from eyes that had once made him feel dismissed. She was yanked to her feet abruptly, as if torn from her seat without a chance to choose otherwise. This wasn't some back alley or a midnight checkpoint. It was a courtroom in broad daylight, surrounded by officials, court clerks, defendants, lawyers, and the public. Yet Hale's actions mirrored an extrajudicial interrogation, one where he played both prosecutor and judge. "Who the hell do you think you are sitting there like that chair belongs to you?" The question came from deep in his throat, laced with venomous contempt. It wasn't because she had broken any rule, it was because she existed in a way that didn't fit his mold. His voice, without a mic, still reached every corner of the room. Anyone previously lost in their paperwork was now forced to look up. The judge had not yet stepped out, a strange lull of a minute stretched between hearings, just enough for nameless authority to speak unchecked. He spoke as if she had stolen a seat meant for someone more deserving, as if merely sitting in a public space without presenting her credentials was a crime. She held her balance with one planted foot, not staggering though pulled out of her composure. Her red blazer was slightly ruffled from the jerk, her other hand resting gently over her stomach, neither blocking nor clenched. Her face showed no shock, not because she had predicted the behavior, but because it seemed this wasn't the first time someone had assumed they had the right to rip her from where she sat. A female clerk stole a glance toward the bench but didn't pick up the internal phone. Two men near the door looked at each other briefly, then turned away. The choice to remain still happened fast, almost unconsciously, as if everyone knew exactly where their limits ended when someone like Hale was involved. He had been praised before for his decisive response, featured in internal bulletins as a model for handling public unrest, and that was what made today's silence a form of complicity. She looked him in the eye for the first time. Her gaze lingered on his face for more than a few seconds, not to condemn or argue, but as if analyzing the structure of a man trained to believe that dragging someone out in front of a crowd was how one proved power. He didn't let go, on the contrary he gripped tighter. When her gaze didn't shift, the veins on his hands swelled along the joints, his muscles drawn like a bow. In his mind, that silence was defiance. He couldn't interpret her calm with anything he had been taught, because the reactions he knew always involved fear, yelling, or at least some sort of excuse. She said nothing, but in that moment the entire room began to see who was truly being exposed. It wasn't her, it was him. Hale no longer controlled the room, even with his hands still locked around her wrist. All his declarations about authority, about order, about who belonged where, rang hollow in the face of someone who didn't need to argue, didn't need to pull away, and didn't need a title to define herself. With each second that passed, This woman was quietly dismantling the very framework through which he understood control. In one corner of the room, someone quietly hit record on their phone. Things hadn't yet escalated to what could be deemed a major violation, but the lens of that camera didn't stray from the small detail at Hale's hand, where his grip crushed into another person's skin like a silent manifesto of violence. No slogans needed. And in that instant, before the court had even begun, something was already on the verge of ending. The side door creaked open. A figure entered, bringing with him the familiar click of security shoes against the tiled floor. The second officer, Vic, younger than Hale, was slimmer but no less sharp in his gaze. He scanned the room quickly and immediately noticed something was off at the front. Hale had a woman's wrist locked in a restraining grip right in the middle of a space meant to be governed by order and decorum. Vic saw everything: the restrained fury in Hale's face, the unmoving stare of the woman in his hold, and the averted eyes of the surrounding crowd. But he didn't step forward, didn't signal to stop, didn't ask why. Vic didn't need an explanation. The situation wasn't new, except this time it was inside a courtroom, and this time it involved a woman in a red blazer. In Vic's mind, anyone who made Hale react that way was automatically a problem. He stood quietly by the door, hands clasped behind his back, not out of fear, but because he had grown used to being a bystander. That role allowed him to exist within the system without being dragged too deeply. But the moment he chose silence became proof of something else. Sometimes neutrality is built on a systemized cowardice. The woman didn't glance at Vic. She knew another uniformed man had entered, but his presence didn't faze her. Her right hand remained restrained, while her left rose slowly, sliding along the edge of her coat and stopping at the inner seam. The motion was gentle, as if she were reaching for something familiar tucked inside a winter coat. A black leather wallet lay there. She pulled it out and opened it once. No introduction, no warning, just one precise, deliberate motion, never repeated. The badge appeared under the sterile ceiling light. The sharp emblem of the FBI Division of Internal Oversight sat cleanly beside her photo ID. The steel-toned trim glinted faintly, needing no further confirmation. No sound was heard, yet everyone in the room felt the thud of something heavy landing on the floor. At that moment, Hale's hand still clutched her wrist, but his body went rigid. His eyes dropped in a split-second stutter, like a man who'd just punched what he thought was drywall only to find out it was reinforced steel. Vic took one more step forward, chest slightly rising, eyes darting from the badge to Hale's face and settling on the hand gripping her wrist. The air thickened with each second, stretched taut by an invisible wire. One more misstep would snap everything beyond repair. But the woman did nothing else. She didn't say, "Do you know who I am?" Didn't declare authority, didn't ask for an apology. The badge was revealed, then folded away and returned to the wallet, like the closing of a book. Hale stepped back a half-pace, not out of respect but from shock. His facial muscles tightened, the threat he had projected since the start of the session now unraveling. Vic finally spoke, voice low, like a man trying to extract himself from trouble. "We should wait for the judge." It was a slow retreat, not of courage, but of someone backing away from a scene he could no longer control. Hale didn't respond. He looked down at her wrist, where a red mark had begun to form, then up at her still, X-rayless face. In his eyes, for the first time, appeared a feeling he had never shown to those he usually labeled as subjects of restraint. A woman holding an FBI badge wasn't what silenced the room. What froze them all was how she existed in that space without needing permission, without explaining, yet forcing everyone to reassess their position. Somewhere in the room, someone still held a phone, recording from beneath the bench, steady, unshaken, because they knew some moments, if missed, could never be reclaimed, not because they were rare, but because they exposed just how easily a system could crumble under the weight of one unflinching stare. The moment the woman opened her wallet and the badge caught the light, the entire room seemed to freeze. Not because anyone ordered it, but because the power embedded in that small object had just crushed the familiar sense of authority each person there believed they held. The silence wasn't born of fear, but of recognition. No one needed to verify whether the badge was real, but the man gripping her wrist couldn't let go of that truth. Hale released her hand immediately, the motion uncontrolled, as if he had touched something scalding, or more dangerous than a live wire. Yet just as his fingertips left her skin, he shouted, a misfired reflex of panic and defense. "This is fake. Verify it now." His voice rose louder than necessary, tinged with both alarm and rage. Part of him knew what had just happened was real, but another part refused to accept that the entire structure of control he had constructed before this crowd could collapse with the flip of a wallet. The woman didn't raise her head. Her right hand moved gently, as if to brush away a strand of hair caught at her collar. But instead of fixing her hair, she lightly dusted off the area of fabric where Hale had gripped her. A wrinkle appeared on the edge of her jacket, faint and small, but the overhead light made it visible, like a scar of misconduct marked right in front of everyone. She smoothed it out with a crisp motion, letting her hand fall away as if correcting a minor detail, not erasing an act of humiliation. That gesture carried no drama, yet it deepened the silence in the room. No words were needed, no further proof required. She had just shown them that she had not been rattled by the tug, nor would she allow the insult to imprint itself on her posture or skin. People often say power is the sound of shouting, of commands, of control. But in that moment, it appeared in the way someone adjusted their collar while two officers still failed to grasp what exactly they had just provoked. A court clerk fumbled with the files in her hands. The judge had not yet appeared, but his presence no longer seemed essential for order to be established. A few turned away confused. Some looked down at their palms, pretending to check phones that had long gone dark. These were not bad people, but they had grown used to the role of bystanders. They had not expected that today, in a space full of rules and rituals, someone would walk in and undo the illusion of safety without even raising their voice. Vic stood still by the door, his usual sharpness gone from his face. He didn't step forward, nor did he move away as if frozen by what he had just witnessed. In his eyes, there was no longer agreement or silent alignment with Hale, only realization. He had just seen a moment that no academy manual had ever prepared him for, a person being forcibly subdued, then reclaiming her place without raising her voice or her hand. Hale, now visibly unsettled, darted his eyes around for someone to echo his outburst, but no one responded. The clearest rejection didn't come in words but in silence. With each passing second he felt more isolated, not because he had been betrayed, but because everyone had suddenly realized he had never truly been the one in control. The clarity in the woman's eyes, paired with the undeniable authority of that FBI badge, reduced every medal, every title he once took pride in to meaningless ornaments. And then nothing else needed to be said. The dynamic had shifted. In a place designed to define right and wrong through sworn statements, today it had taken only the flip of a wallet and a single look to force everyone to confront the truth they had been avoiding. Those accustomed to watching from the sidelines were now faced with something none of them wanted to admit. Sometimes justice doesn't come from the bench, it begins with the chair that gets dragged away. The woman had already tucked the leather wallet back into her coat before the court's record clerk approached. The middle-aged man, wearing thin-rimmed glasses and usually associated only with transcripts and cautious nods, now had to confront what the entire room had been avoiding, verifying the legitimacy of the badge just displayed. He bent down, examined the embossed insignia, the steel-tone trim, and the code sequence. It aligned precisely with federal agency identification standards. It didn't take long, just a nod, no explanation, no need for more. The entire room seemed to contract under the suffocating weight of belated awareness. Those who had once clicked their tongues when Hale entered, who had chosen to look away when the woman was forced to stand, now fell silent as if their voices had lost meaning. Not because they were forbidden but because everyone realized that any word uttered now would be an admission of shared guilt, guilt for not stopping it, not stepping in, not asking why, not holding on to that strange moment when it first began. The sound of the judge's shoes echoed from the back of the room. The elderly magistrate, robed in heavy black, stepped in with the measured pace of someone long accustomed to restoring order. But the moment he crossed the threshold, he sensed the silent pressure strung across the courtroom. It wasn't the usual solemnity, it carried the scent of something more deeply fractured than any case he was about to preside over. And then he saw the woman in the red blazer, standing in the center, not at the defendant's bench nor in the witness area. She was turned toward him. Her voice rang out for the first time in that space, not loud, not needing to be repeated. "I need this court session closed. There is a serious internal violation." The sentence carried no command, yet the tone allowed no one to treat it as a suggestion. The judge paused mid-step, no longer advancing, his eyes narrowing slightly at the phrase internal violation. He knew what it meant, and he knew that for such a phrase to be spoken aloud in an open court, the speaker must possess authority above the entire standard hierarchy. The silence stretched one beat longer before he turned to the record clerk. Their eyes met in unspoken confirmation. That earlier nod was not only for the badge, It was a signal to the entire system that this woman stood in the right place at the right time with the right jurisdiction. From that moment on, roles within the courtroom began to reverse. The one who had been seated below now had the power to end the trial. The one who entered projecting dominance now stood back like a student awaiting reprimand. She didn't step onto the judge's platform. She didn't need to state her name or agency again. What she had said was enough for the judge to understand that control had shifted. The authority to decide who could stay and who had to leave was no longer his. He simply nodded once, without needing to ask anyone else, and in a rare gesture, not bound by legal protocol but weighty nonetheless, he slightly inclined his head toward the female coordinator, who understood immediately and stepped forward to unplug the microphone, signaling a halt to all proceedings. The woman quietly turned around, walking past the clerk's desk, her gaze falling on no one, not because she was ignoring them but because at this point no one needed acknowledgement. She had seen enough, heard enough, and known enough to understand that what had just occurred wasn't merely a case of overreach, but a symptom of a structural disease, abuse shielded by uniform and indifference justified by those around it. And this time the person who stepped in to reveal it didn't need to shout, didn't need permission to speak. She came to end a habit, and with one brief sentence she did just that. Her name appeared on the official mandate, printed clearly in bold at the top corner with the authenticated signature from the Federal Bureau of Investigation just below it. Adrienne Rowe, inspector from the Internal Abuse Oversight Unit, holds federal authority. She did not need to explain anything further. The document was placed gently on the table, right within view of the court clerk and the legal representative of the review panel. They glanced at it, flipped through a few pages, then exchanged looks, as if each line on the paper were slicing through the familiarity of this courtroom's routine procedures. Nothing was unfolding according to the sequence they all knew by heart. The hearing was not interrupted because the defendant was absent or due to technical failure, but because the person standing in the middle of the courtroom was a legally appointed representative, sent to investigate the very institution holding the trial. Adrienne did not state that as a warning. She handed over the document calmly, almost coldly, as if everything was proceeding according to a timeline she had laid out long before. Her hands carried no emotion, only precise preparations designed to leave no room for objection. Immediately after, she requested a full shutdown of the courtroom's automated recording equipment. It was an uncommon request, but legitimate under an emergency internal audit order. 2 court technicians, though visibly hesitant, did not delay. They powered off the cameras and transferred all footage recorded before shutdown onto a secured portable device, then handed it to her under official sealing protocol. Every step was supervised by the judge himself, who relinquished control of the public hearing with nothing more than a nod. The tension in the courtroom did not come from the accused, but from those operating the system itself. They knew that an emergency audit was the last thing anyone wanted to witness in their workplace. It did not merely imply oversight, it cast doubt on the safety, transparency, and integrity of every procedure they had carried out until now. And the person raising that doubt was not an outsider, nor someone with a press badge or camera. She came as a representative from within, someone the system had once claimed was beyond error. Adrienne did not raise her badge a second time. She did not repeat her title or name. She asked only one question in an even and resolute voice. Who approved coercive measures inside court premises during the past 12 months? No one responded right away, not because they didn't know, but because no one had ever considered that the question would be asked. Everything that had taken place until now had been understood as an internal reflex. Anyone behaving unusually, anyone uncooperative, anyone deemed unfit could be removed. She placed a second copy of the order on the table, addressed to the Interagency Human Resources representative. That version requested a list of all coercive actions executed during public trials, from documented incidents to those never officially recorded. Some staff began to shift uncomfortably. One person glanced at their phone, not to check the time, but to confirm whether the hallway security cameras were still active. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew if that list were fully examined, many names thought buried in old case files would be summoned again. Adrienne paid no attention to personal reactions. She was not there to arrest individuals. She was there to find the fracture point in a chain of behaviors once considered legal simply because they had never been questioned. And today's act, carried out in the middle of a public hearing with dozens of witnesses, was only the most recent proof of something that had existed far longer than anyone in the room could remember. No one tried to stop her, not because they agreed, but because they knew that if they remained silent, her next steps would no longer be investigative. They would dismantle the very system they had once called order. Hale's shout burst out like the last convulsion of a man watching power slip through his fingers. He could no longer maintain even breathing, nor conceal his confusion. "You don't have the authority to run this room." His voice didn't sound like protest. It was more the desperate self-defense of someone being pushed out of his familiar place. But that sentence never had the chance to echo off the courtroom stone walls before another voice answered. The federal officer's voice cut in, not loud but clear enough to silence the entire room instantly. "She's operating under Code 7C. Just one brief sentence, needing no further explanation. Those in the profession understood what that code implied. It did not merely represent an internal investigation, it granted the agent authority equivalent to a regional command within the scope of misconduct. From that moment on, any obstructive response would no longer be seen as dissent, it would be considered interference with a high-level federal operation. Hale was speechless. His eyes still held defiance, but his foot slid half a step back, as if his body understood what was happening before his mind was willing to admit it. Around him no one spoke. The silent support he had once relied on was now nowhere to be found. Some looked down at the files in front of them, others spun their pens as if to release tension. The glances that had once aligned with them, that had once endorsed the quick solution, were now searching for a safe exit, and this time the epicenter of risk was him. Adrian stood tall. She didn't turn back, nor did she appear disturbed by the previous outburst. The intervention from her colleague had saved her from having to explain something that every seasoned professional should already understand. She turned toward the court clerk, her voice calm but firm, requesting all relevant files, including a detailed record of coercive actions carried out by the two officers involved in today's incident. Time frame, the past 18 months. The request wasn't made to pinpoint a single mistake, but to expose a pattern, recurring signs, behavioral trends too consistent to be dismissed as random. The clerk hesitated briefly, then nodded and turned to retrieve the documents. Every movement in the room now slowed, tinged with caution. Those who normally carried out procedures with confidence were now checking every step, as if any misstep might be noted and later scrutinized. Adrian didn't demand speed, she demanded accuracy. She knew that haste was a favored tool of those who abused authority, used to justify procedural shortcuts, and its opposite, deliberate precision, was how one separates professional reflex from its underlying truth. She didn't watch the clerk, instead her eyes scanned the room, the desks, the walkways, the defendant's bench, the cameras, the judge's platform, and the public seating. To her, each space was a potential scene where improper coercion had once occurred. She wasn't looking for individuals, she was looking for the habit, a habit built over hundreds of unchecked moments when no one asked why, when no one questioned the process. The file was brought out and placed before her, pages stacked thick with overlapping red stamps from old reports, blurred to the point where it was hard to tell what was a unique event and what was merely a recycled pattern. She flipped through every page, skipping nothing. Some reports were barely a paragraph long, citing forced compliance with vague phrases like uncooperative, disruptive behavior, or failure to follow officer instructions. No videos attached, no named witnesses, just repetitive, one-sided descriptions in identical language. She marked each case coinciding with Hale and Vic's shifts. With every mark, another wave of silence settled over the room. Those present began to feel the weight, not of paper, but of responsibilities dropped across too many hands. Adrian didn't need explanations. Every line in the file posed a question that didn't need an answer. If everything had been legitimate, why did everyone look away the moment she asked to reopen each case? The courtroom door closed behind them, sealing off the clamor of scattered files with the cold silence of a white stone hallway. The yellow lights overhead weren't warm enough to erase the tension etched across the young man's face as he stood opposite Adrian. He wore a gray suit, his tie off center by a few inches as if he had tugged at it during a long meeting, but what made him uneasy wasn't his attire. His eyes dropped slightly, then quickly met hers again, as if he had prepared a confession but wasn't sure he had the right to be forgiven. "I saw it happen," he said, his voice barely louder than the hum of the air conditioner in the distance. "And I turned away." The words fell from his mouth like a stone sliding off a cliff. Irretrievable, unquestionable. He didn't need to explain what it was or who had been dragged out or during which trial or for what reason. Adrian didn't ask. She stood still, hands behind her back, her gaze fixed straight ahead as though listening to an internal affairs briefing rather than a personal confession. "I didn't come here for people to bow their heads," she replied, her tone steady, free of visible emotion. "I came so that." Canvas.